Let's create this swinging text animation. Create a new composition. I'll just call this one swinging text. 5 seconds is fine. 1920 by 1080. First, I'm going to create a background. So Command Y to bring up our new solid settings, or layer new solid, and choose whatever color you want. That's our background, and I'm going to lock that in place. Next, let's add our text. And when I build out my kinetic typography or just my titles, I like to build out the entire scene with all the text and then animate everything. That is just how I like to work. Under characters, I'm using the Futura font. Let's make it white. And then let me just create our text. U. I think this is a little too big, so let's just take that, drag it down. And then I'll duplicate it, making sure our shape path visibility is on. Drag it down, and I'm holding the Shift key to lock it as I drag it down, so it stays straight, aligned with this top one. R. Take my selection tool again, then duplicate, drag down, and awesome. So build that out, and then I also want you to move the anchor point to the top of each text layer because we want it to rotate from that anchor point. So taking my anchor point, holding the command button to bring it to the top center for all of these. Cool, so what we can do is actually animate the first one and then copy and paste those settings to the second two layers. So with the U text selected, let's turn on 3D. Actually, let's do that for both of these other layers. Then press R. We're going to be rotating the X rotation. So like I always like to do, I like to set my endpoint first. So let's go to, say, around 4 seconds and set a keyframe for X rotation. This is our landing point. Then go back to 0 seconds and let's rotate this backwards. Now, this is a little confusing for some people. So typically you would think that rotating at 90 degrees would be perfectly sort of straight and you wouldn't see it, because if you rotate it 360 degrees, it rotates completely one full turn, and then splitting that by 4, it should be kind of perfectly horizontal. But that's not how it works with an After Effects composition. Depending on where a layer is, you might have to adjust the starting rotation point. So I'm going to rotate this to something like about 98. So, or 98 to start out with. And we'll start from there because we want to swing in like so. But we want it to swing in, up, and then back and forward. So let's set another keyframe around 1 second. And we're going to rotate it all the way up to like -40, which is actually bringing it in front of the camera or towards you as the viewer. Then let's go back to 2 seconds, rotate it back to something like 25. And you can play around with these numbers, but so I'm swinging up to 40, back to 25, up to, let's do -10, and then back to 0. So if I play through this, you'll see it swing on, and okay, it's kind of lame. What we have to do is add some easy easing and play with the timing. So select all of our keyframes, F9 on our keyboard, and now let's go into our graph editor. So just like we did with the bouncing ball, what needs to happen is it needs to sort of hang up in time when it reaches the peak of its swing. So it's swinging down, it gets faster, 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 and then when it goes up, it slows down. So make sure we're on the speed graph, and then let's select all of these layers or all of these keyframes, and we're just going to drag them in. So you can see now if I select all the layers or all the keyframes and then take the points or these handles, it affects all of the keyframes, which is a quick way to affect the speed of multiple keyframes. So that's pretty cool. The one keyframe that I don't need to do that on is this first one because it's going to be going fast already. It doesn't have to slow into this animation right here. So I'm going to take this first handle, drag it to the left. That's pretty cool. But let's go back to our regular view out of the graph editor, and let's just make this a little bit shorter. So this first one about there, take these ones in like so. With the swing, unlike the bouncing ball, it kind of gets slower and slower and slower. the bouncing ball, when it bounced, it got faster and faster and faster until the last little bounce, but now it kind of swings fast, slow, slow, slow. So let's make this first one a little bit less fast or quick. And we'll also add motion blur to all these layers. So for all these layers, select the motion blur and enable it right here for our timeline. Cool, that looks pretty darn good. We can play with this, finesse the speed, but now you have your basic 3D swinging text animation. I can take all of these keyframes, copy them, just Command C, Control C if you're on a PC, then select both of these other layers, selecting one, shift clicking the next one, and pasting it. So Command V. So here's what I was talking about. With the rotation, so if I bring up the X rotation by pressing U for all my keyframes, at 98 degrees back, the awesome text is really on the frame. So I want to crank this down to something like 86. And then for the R text, probably something like 92. So let's swing that on, and that looks pretty good. Loop it a little bit quicker so I can just watch. Yeah, that looks pretty good. One thing that makes this animation look better is staggering the animation. So the first one comes down, and then as soon as the U text swings down, the R text starts to fall down. So let's stagger it. So with my selection tool, just drag this layer to the right. And let's go to where the R text swings down, right about there, and then start the awesome text right there too. You can kind of see that it's staggered and it looks like it's flopping down. That's our basic swinging text animation. In the one that I created originally, we have this sort of exit where they all swing around the vertical or the y-axis and they disappear that way. An easy way to do that is with a null object. A null object is basically an invisible object that you can use to affect other layers that are parented to it. So let's walk through that to explain it a little bit more clearly. To create a null object, go to Layer, New, Null Object. Now, when I did that, nothing happened. You see this little mark up here that shows where the quote-unquote anchor point is for the null object, but there's really nothing there. When I export this, you're not going to see this little red square, which is for that null object. It's just this sort of invisible layer. Think of it as an adjustment layer if you've worked with adjustment layers in Photoshop. Not that it adjusts everything beneath this layer, but that you can parent things to it. So instead of having to rotate all of these three layers individually, and also instead of having to pre-comp them, which we could do, we could pre-comp these three layers and then spin that pre-comp out with a rotation animation. All on this composition, we can parent them. So let's take these three layers, parent them to the null object, make the null object a 3D layer, bring up rotation by pressing R, and now when I spin the Y rotation, you can see that it is rotating our text. And actually, because our text is still swinging down, it kind of looks pretty cool. It's kind of like this matrixy kind of effect. That's kind of cool, actually. But what we're going to do is just rotate them out once they get down. So around 3.5 seconds, let's set a keyframe for the Y rotation. And then at 4.5 seconds, let's rotate to the right. So we're going to go to the left, go negative, actually with our dragging, and about there. So negative 90. So now if we play through this end part, let's just show you what happens. So it rotates, and it rotates off pretty much completely, which is good. But just to be safe, I'm going to trim these three layers to this point. So selecting these three layers, I'm going to press Option right bracket. So that's Alt right bracket for Windows users. And now they are off completely. Let's easy ease this text or these keyframes. So right click, keyframe assistant, easy ease or F9. And then let's play with this speed because it doesn't pop. So let's go into our graph editor, drag the 2 points in like so. That has more of a pop. One thing that I did with this text, actually, which is pretty cool, is it sort of rotates back and then it rotates off. So it rotates to the left and then it rotates right and it disappears. There's different ways to do that. I could create another keyframe here where it rotates to the right, or actually it's rotating to the left, but our Y rotation number is dragged to the right. And you could play around with the speed of that and that could work, but there's an easier way to do this. And that's with our graph editor. So again, going into our graph editor, this time we're going to our value graph. So we see that our value graph for the X rotation goes from 0 to -90. And that's that number right there, that green highlighted number. If I select this keyframe and take this handle and drag up, what happens is that now it's rotating up. So it's rotating to positive like 15 and then back to -90. So that's how you can quickly get that sort of opposite rotation before it rotates off. And doing those little subtle animations like that makes it look a little bit more professional, makes it look a little bit more dynamic. So let's increase just a little bit. Cool. It's kind of like revving up to go. It starts, then it speeds up and gets off our frame. Let's go back to our whole composition, play through this, and this is a really great animation that you can use for all kinds of kinetic typography, for all kinds of professional motion graphics for your own projects. It's one of the most frequently used text animations that I use for introducing new text to my viewers. Awesome. If you have any questions, let me know. Otherwise, in the next lesson, we're going to be moving on to this other composition working in 3D space, literally creating this 3D space scene.